Moving on now, following a meeting in Washington with his Israeli and United Arab Emirates counterparts, Secretary of State Antony Blinken has laid out a tougher U.S. stance towards Tehran's new government. Washington has said that it is ready to consider all options if Iran is unwilling to return to the 2015 nuclear deal. In adding using phrases like all options or every option, which is typically intended to suggest some sort of military action. Blinken has said that the United States and Israel were united in opposing Iran developing a nuclear weapon.
We would like to see a mutual return to compliance with the JCPOA, but Iran's responses, or rather lack thereof, have not been encouraging. And so we are watching Iran's comments, posture, very, very carefully. And as the minister said, we are prepared to turn to other options if Iran doesn't change course.
Now, Blinken laid out clearly that the U.S. would continue to engage diplomatically with Tehran. However, the U.S. Secretary of State said that it takes to engage in diplomacy, now stating that Iran's efforts to breach some kind of understanding with the U.S. had not been adequate.
Iran has been using this time to advance its nuclear program in a variety of ways, including enriching uranium to 20% and even 60%, using more advanced centrifuges, acquiring more knowledge. And so that runway is getting shorter. I'm not going to put a specific date on it, but with every passing day and Iran's refusal to engage in good faith, the runway gets short. And so, as the foreign minister said, we are discussing this among ourselves, and we will look at every option to deal with the challenge posed by Iran. We continue to believe that diplomacy is the most effective way to do that, but it takes two to engage in diplomacy, and we have not seen from Iran a willingness to do that at this point.
An Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid doubled down on his counterpart's statements and called the Iranian government a terror regime. Lapid proclaimed that Tehran would race to the bomb if they believed the world was not serious about stopping them.
There are moments when nations must use force to protect the world from evil. If a terror regime is going to acquire a nuclear weapon, we must act. We must make clear that the civilized world won't allow it. If the Iranians don't believe the world is serious about stopping them, they'll race to the bomb.
Now, this meeting also saw the foreign ministers of Israel and the UAE reiterate their commitment to normalizing relations and upholding peace. Last year, Israel and the UAE agreed to normalize ties under the Abraham Accords, secured under the administration of former U.S. President Donald Trump. The deal also sought to seek solutions to long-standing and confounding issues within West Asia, such as the fight against Iran as well as the Palestinian issue. And to that effect, UAE Foreign Minister Abdullah bin Zayed highlighted concerns that Israel and Palestine had not been on talking terms and that peace in the region depended crucially on the relationship between Israel and Palestine. Adding to this, bin Zayed also said that his country was impressed with the growing bilateral relationship with Israel and that he would soon visit.
And see the great work. But
the Palestinians are going to be the most important element of the success of peace in the region. We cannot just talk about peace in the region without the neighbors. The Palestinians and the Israelis are not in talking terms to start with. So I'm quite excited to see that in the last few weeks, Israeli ministers are starting to meet with the PA. This is a good start.
Now, as part of efforts to deepen ties with Palestinians, Secretary of State Blinken also said that the U.S. is planning to reopen its consulate in Jerusalem. Israel's new cross-partisan government opposes this, but the U.S. had traditionally directed diplomatic outreach to the Palestinians from this consulate before it was closed by Donald Trump in 2018. And WION correspondent Kate Fisher sent us this report from Washington, D.C. Let's listen in.
This meeting, a trilateral meeting at the US State Department between Secretary of State Antony Blinken and the foreign ministers of Israel and the United Arab Emirates, was really to build upon and celebrate the Abraham Accords. Those agreements normalized relations between Israel and a handful of Arab countries. And were the landmark foreign policy achievement of Joe Biden's predecessor, President Donald Trump. Yet, perhaps a little belatedly, the Biden administration is now embracing that. Concern, of course, from the Palestinians who feel left out in the cold by some of their Arab neighbouring countries, normalising their relations with Israel. But the US State Department stressing that this normalisation was no substitute for a two-state solution, and that they hope that the normalisation could actually be used as leverage to take that process further. Iran also high up on the agenda during the trilateral meeting. Concern from all three countries that Iran needed to revive the talks to try to get that nuclear deal back into action. Secretary of State Antony Blinken saying that it was the runway for reviving talks, reviving that deal was getting shorter and shorter. Other things to come out of this meeting, a plan for two trilateral teams, one that would look at promoting religious coexistence and another for cooperation on water and energy. And also more encouragement for Sudan to formally sign on to this. That is the fourth country normalising its relations with Israel, but because of domestic political unrest, they've yet to do that formally. So an important set of meetings for these three countries, and the Biden administration now embracing one of Donald Trump's key foreign policy achievements.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.